Alright, so Taco Phil here. I decided to do a video about one of the most common questions I come across. I think I've easily been asked it like 50, damn near 100 times now. What's the best motor to put in your Subaru Beetle swap? Now, there are a bunch of trains of thought on this particular subject because most of the time people look at three different aspects. They look at the easiest motor to get your hand on, the most power, and the least hassle. And what I mean by hassle is these motors are notorious for having issues, mostly regarding their head gaskets. You know, one of the big things that you're going to come across when doing the Subaru powered Beetle is basically, are you going to take a motor that works and rebuild it, or are you going to find a motor that runs and just stick it in your Beetle? Now, when I started, I did the latter. I found a running car. It was running fine. I got it cheap from a repair shop because like the previous owner had banged up the front end and destroyed the radiator and all that. But the motor was still intact. It still ran. And I ran my motor for a little over a year before the head gasket went. Now, my motor had, I think, around 170 or a little over 170,000 miles on it. So close to the lifespan of a Subaru motor. I mean, I've seen some Subaru motors, like the motor I got now, is like 200,000 miles on it, and it's still going. And I decided, to make sure that weren't going to be any issues anytime soon, to just go ahead and rebuild it. But some people don't have that luxury. You have the motor, you don't want to rebuild it. You don't have the skill, you don't have the money. If you're doing somebody, taking it to somebody else to rebuild it, it can be an expensive job. I mean, when I first had the blown head gasket, I talked to a couple of places, and I think the cheapest rebuild quote I got was like $2,500. It's a pricey deal. So it really depends on how you want to do it. If you can incur that hit when you first get, go nuts. If you know what you're doing, you should be fine. One of the first bit of advice I tell everybody is do your research, find some friends. I save literally thousands of dollars by spreading out the work, between different people, and doing a lot of it myself. I literally had people saying they wanted to charge me hundreds of dollars just to put the wiring together. I sent my wire harness to get cut down and modded, but just to connect the ECU and the wiring to the Beetle, people were quoting me like $500. I literally spent like a day, or just not even a day, a few hours just piecing it together myself, and didn't spend a dime. I mean, with the exception of $2, $3 I spent for some butt connectors. So, doing your research is definitely key. So, I'm going to talk about, in my opinion, this is my opinion. I'm not a Subaru expert. I just did a lot of research. I've talked to a lot of Subaru owners. I've talked to a lot of Beetle conversion people, and these are my recommendations for a good Subaru swap motor to put in your Beetle. Now, if you have a Vanagon, or you're going to do a bus, which is like, the next big, most common, then honestly, go with an H6. Don't waste your money, don't waste your time. I know a lot of people, they want to get the EJ22, the EJ25, and put it in their van or bus. But if you're going to be putting in a bigger motor, you're going to be eating more gas, but you want that power. You got a bus. Get an H6. It will literally fit in there just a little bit more snugger than a turbo EJ25, and you get that big V6 power out of it. Or yeah, you get that big 6-cylinder power out of it. If you got a bus, if you got a Vanagon, spend the extra money. I've seen plenty of 2000 and up Foresters with the H6 motor in it, and it's a beast. It's a great motor for a van or a bus. So if you have a Vanagon or a bus, get an H6. Don't waste your time with any smaller motor. I mean, in the long run, that's probably one of the best motors you can get. And you can turbo those too, and have an even crazier V6 turbo motor. So, get an H6. Now back to my Beetle guys. Now, when people ask me what's the best motor to get in there, first I want to look at budget. Now, some Subaru motors are very expensive. If you want to get your hands on a late model EJ25 turbo, from like a WRX, you're gonna spend like $3 grand for a motor, you know. But if you get your hands on the rare EJ22T or even an EJ20T, they're turbo motors, and you can have them for as cheap as $1 grand. They're not super expensive, but then they have their own complications. If you're going to stick with a stock ECU, you should be okay, but then it becomes a pain in the butt for piping, fitting. It can be a bit of a pain. The motor that's in this picture right here is actually a EJ22T, I believe. Or not 22, it's an EJ20T. Can also be mistaken for an EJ205, which can come in the turbo or non-turbo variant, and that's the 2-liter, which is a good motor. You can get your hands on an EJ25 or an EJ22 or EJ20T. They can be anywhere from 175 up to 220 horsepower, depending on the year. And a 200 horsepower Beetle is a scary thing. It's a scary, beautiful thing. But I wouldn't recommend it. Turbos bring in other problems. If you're going to turbo your motor, you need to change the transmission. You're going to have to either go with a Pro Street or the Subi Gears 5-speed, and they're expensive. So think of that. So if you're a budget-minded person, you want a good motor, maybe you don't want to rebuild it. I would always recommend rebuilding, from all the problems I dealt with. Then if you're budget-minded, you want good power, you want good reliability, and you want it to just still look like a stock Subaru from the outside. You want to save your stock transmission. But you want that good get up and go. Go with a Phase 2 EJ22. Some people will be like, "Oh, get with the 25." It's a good amount more power and torque. Well, you know what? The EJ25s are notorious for head gasket failures. I think that they've got like something crazy, like a 70 or 80% head gasket failure on the EJ25s. The EJ25s are because they have the thinner walls. They have thinner walls, they have more stress points, they're just more viable for warping and failing. I've talked to so many Subaru experts, and they told me, the EJ25 is a good motor, but you run a higher risk of a blown head gasket. The EJ22s, they have the thicker walls, they're just built, because they're just thicker, they're just built better. Sure, you're not going to get, EJ25 power out of it, but then we're talking like a mixture of maybe like 10, 15 horsepower. It's not a huge loss, and with the mods that you can do with it, you can easily make up for that power. Now, the important thing to remember is Phase 2. Phase 1 EJ22s are good motors as well, but you're going to be limiting yourself in the future. EJ22, a Phase 1 is a pre-98 or 98 and older Subaru motor, and the Phase 2 is a 99 and up motor. Now, how can you tell the difference between a Phase 1 and a Phase 2? Simple, by looking at the sides of the motor, the valve covers here. If you look at the valve covers on the left-hand side, you see how the plugs are at the top of the case. They're not in the motor like this one. They don't go into the block. They go into the valve cover. If the plugs go into the valve cover and you have this flat side, it's an EJ2. He goes, it's a Phase 2. So this is a 99 plus motor right here. This one, where it's got the ridges and the spark plugs go into the block here, this is a Phase 1 motor. It's got this ribbed here. It's got the 16 valve badge on it. This is a Phase 1 motor. Now, the main differences as far as power goes, they're negligible. An EJ22 with an EJ22 Phase 1 is going to run you maybe like 150 horsepower. An EJ22, early EJ22 Phase 2 is probably going to run you like 155 to 165 horsepower. So it's a negligible horsepower. Now, if you get your hands on a later EJ22, then they can get up to around 170 horsepower, 175 horsepower. So that's what I would look for. It'll be easier to maintain, easier to get your hands on. They're a little bit, if you get past a 2000 and I think 2008 was the last major years for the head gasket failures, then you should be okay with pulling one of these motors and sticking it in. If you're going to get anything between a 99 to a 2005, you have a chance of having the head gasket failure, but not as high as the EJ25s. The EJ25s, they were rampant. The 22s, not so much. So you could be okay with just sticking an EJ22 from a 99 and up and being fine. Now, these cars, these motors, EJ22s, you're gonna find them in your Legacies. You're gonna find them in your Foresters. You're gonna find them, or not your Foresters. You're gonna find them in your Outbacks. You're gonna find them in your older Imprezas. Now, it's not super easy to find. You can find them out there. I went to the yard and I found a good amount of the pre-98 motors, but they're just not worth it. I mean, after a while, it's going to get harder and harder to find parts for it. It's going to be harder and harder to maintain these guys. You're going to be limiting yourself on the wiring. That's another thing. Phase 1 and Phase 2 use completely different wiring. So let's say you got your hands on a cheap Phase 1 and you want to upgrade to a more powerful Phase 2. If you have a Phase 1 and you're going to a more powerful Phase 1, let's say you got an EJ20 and you want to do an EJ25 from a Phase 1, you can just plug and play. They have three connections here. Let's see if I can zoom in on it. They have three ECU connections here that connect to the ECU. And they plug and play. You can swap out ECUs, you can swap out wire harnesses, they all work. The ECU, you want to try and keep the ECU for the motor you have. You can, for instance, put an EJ22 ECU on an EJ25, but you lose a little bit of horsepower when you do that. Now, the Phase 2s only have two connections. They have two large gray connections, or two large brown connections, sorry. They have two large brown connections versus the two gray and the one white connection. So they use completely different wiring systems. They use completely different map sensors. They use completely different cranks positioning sensors. So you can't swap them. So if you're budget friendly, you want a good motor that'll last you a while. Maybe you don't want to do the head gaskets right away, but you want to get it running. Get you a Phase 2 EJ22. It's just a good motor. It's very bulletproof. You can boost them pretty well too. You can easily, well, I don't want to say easily because, it's going to require programming. It's going to require a good amount of modifications. But you can reasonably, without having to do a lot of rebuilding the motor and, crazy mapping and custom ECUs, you can throw a turbo from a early model EJ25, from like an Impreza or an WRX. You can throw those turbos onto an EJ22 and you can get those guys up to 200 horsepower on stock internals. Now, obviously, each motor is different and you run it at your own risk. But pretty much from all the experts I've talked to, you can get up to about, I think it's like 8 or 10 pounds of boost on those stock internals. So you can easily get close to 200 horsepower on a stock EJ22, for the later years. You may even get more, So keep that in mind if you're budget minded. If you want to keep your build under, let's say, $2,500, stock EJ22 from a 99 model car up, super easy to find. They are a dime a dozen. You're going to come across a good amount of those in the junkyards, easier than you're going to come across a solid EJ22 from a pre-98. Now, if you got some money to spend, and by money to spend, I'm like saying, let's say your budget is not $2,500, or let's say $3,000 for your typical swap. Let's say you got $5,000 to spend. The next motor I would recommend is the EJ205. Now, the EJ205 is, again, a Phase 2 motor, dual overhead cam, turbo motor. Those motors, they're, again, a dime a dozen. You can get your hands on a good EJ205 for about, I think like around $1,200, $1,300. It adds a little bit more to your build, but if you got stock ECU, you got all that, you're ready to put it in, it's a solid working motor, you can get these all day from any of those importers. Any of the JDM importers, all day you will find these motors. The EJ205 turbo motors, the EJ 25 turbo motors. Those are a little more expensive, but you can get these low miles, good head gaskets, under warranty, a dime a dozen from just about any JDM importer. I mean, the only thing you got to deal with is you got to think a little bit more about your piping. You got to have an intercooler. You got to have piping for that intercooler. So you might have to do a little more modding. I've seen people do it to where they're able to get it all underneath the deck lid, but you're gonna have to do a little more planning. Also, the other things you're gonna have to do is if you start messing around with the dual overhead cam motors, you're gonna have to cut the back. Now, if you have an EJ20, EJ22, or even the 25 dual overhead single overhead cam, you can do minimal cutting, minimal modding to the back, and you don't have to really cut into it. I don't know, maybe later on you want to decide to sell it and you want to keep that motor for another project and you want to put the stock Beetle motor back in, for whatever reason, you don't want to cut it. Stick with the EJ22 or even an EJ 2.20 or EJ25 single overhead cam because you don't have to do much cutting. If you go with the dual overhead cam, you are going to have to cut it. It just will not fit under here. You're going to have to do some cutting, you're going to have to do some modding. Not super modding, you're not going to have to do any major welding. It's just a matter of cutting and bolting. You'll be good. Some people don't want to cut into their firewall. Some people don't want to cut their frame. It's really up to you. If you're doing this kind of mod, you just kind of just go the whole way. The EJ22 motor is a good motor, but it's not a Porsche motor. It's not a WRX motor. It's not a super fast motor. You might get 100 and something miles per hour out of it, but you're not going to be beating Porsches down the street. With EJ25 tune, yeah, you can give a Porsche a run for their money. I've taken on plenty of Mercedes and freaking BMWs, even with just a slightly modded EJ22. Shit, I was racing when I blew the head gasket on the damn EJ22. So, just be aware that if you really want the bang for your buck, the turbo EJ205 motor is going to be one of your easiest. It's going to be one of your main go-to engines. The only thing that makes it a little bit of a pain in the butt is getting your hands on an ECU. Because these motors are typical for your WRXs. They're typical for your STIs and all that good stuff. Tons of them are crash, so tons of them have good motors. And in Japan, they have different smog and emission rules, so you come across a lot of low mileage JDM motors that are imported from Japan just because they're not allowed to have them anymore because of their high mileage. So you got to get your hands on an ECU. You can go with an aftermarket ECU, but unless you know what you're doing, that's another pricey deal. That's why I said if you got a couple grand to spend, like $5,000, you can get one of these builds. Companies like Outfront, they do a standalone ECU, which they tune it, they try to get as much power out of it as they can, and you basically just bring them the wires. They give you the ECU, they give you all the wire, they take care of all the wiring. It's just a plug and play type deal when it's all said and done. That wiring setup though is going to run you $1,400, $1,500. I didn't have an extra $1,500. I paid the $500 to get mine wired down at Subi Stuff down in Marietta, and I sent them my wire harness and my stock ECU, and that cost me about $500. $500 for EJ22. I think for the turbo is going to be a little more. You're probably looking at close to like the $650 range. So that would be my ideal money if I had money. My ideal motor, if I had money, it would be the EJ205, or even if you get your hands on an EJ25 turbo, that's the way to go. So keep that in mind. Stay away from the phase ones. The phase ones, sure, they're cheap, but you're gonna have tons of problems. I got my hand how I came across it is I had my hands on a phase 2, and I was just, by the time I started mocking everything up, I was like, geez, I'm gonna have to replace the wiring, I'm gonna replace the ECU, I'm gonna have to do all types of shit. And then that's if the even motor worked perfectly. I might have to do even more to the motor. And then I was like, it's all said and done, I might as well just go with the freaking 2.5. So that's what I did. I was lucky to get my hands on an EJ25 in good running condition, and I still decided to rebuild it. And I'm like in a grand into it right now, and I have like buddies helping me out. I got a buddy of mine who does it on the side, and he's working on it. I gotta wait a week or two to get it done because he's doing it in his spare time. But I saved some money. But altogether, I think I'm spending like maybe like 1300 $1,400 just on my rebuild. You know, I'm trying to do a full rebuild, so that's the main thing. I want this car to go for another 100,000, 200,000 miles. So keep that in mind. Stay away from because don't waste your times with an EJ18, or an EJ20, because honestly, if you're gonna get your hands on an old EJ18 or an EJ20, you're better off just building a beetle motor. You're gonna have less complications. You don't have to worry about ducting. You don't have to worry about ECUs. And by the time you're done trying to get any power out of that, you could have just spent another grand or so, and got a 1914 cammed with and still because I think like an EJ18 is gonna get you like 100 horsepower. EJ20 it might get you like 110, 120 tops. It's not worth it when you can get 100 horsepower out of a good beetle motor, you know. So EJ22 Phase 2 motor. If you can get your hands on a donor car, that's the best way to go because you're going to need all those. You're going to need your map. You're going to need your, depending on where you live, I would recommend keeping your environmental sensor, your elevation sensor. If you're staying with a stock ECU, you're going to need your mass airflow sensor. You're going to need little wires here and there. Keep it. Keep it. And also get your speed sensor. If you're sticking with the stock ECU, get your speed sensor. Now, not every motor needs a speed sensor, but I have found that through my builds, the speed sensor helps a lot. It helps with idling. It helps with fuel economy. It just makes the motor run a lot better. I was having a lot of idling issues. I was having a weird issue where it would start and run fine, but as soon as I stopped at like a stoplight or a stop sign, it would start to idle low, and then it would start running on like 3 cylinders to find out it needed the speed sensor. The speed sensor fixed all those issues, made it run 10 times cooler, and make sure you plug all your vacuum lines. You'd be surprised how many times I've had issues, or I've had friends with issues that were just like, this thing's running like crap, I don't understand, and it just turned out to be an unplugged vacuum line. These things are super temperamental. Super temperamental. So, to reiterate, EJ22 Phase 2, if you're budget minded, they're a dime a dozen. You got money to spend, like an extra $2,000, get your hands on an EJ205 turbo motor or an EJ25 turbo motor. Stay away from the EJ22 turbo motors. They're not bad motors. They're good motors. And I'm not talking about a built one. I'm talking about from the rare Legacy GT. Some people love that EJ22 turbo motor that came out for a little bit. It's a good motor, but it's not worth it. I mean, even though it's a turbo motor, I think you're only getting like 160 horsepower or 165 horsepower. I mean, sure, you can try and boost a little bit more, but then you get into the headache of now you need to change the ECU. You need to reprogram because Phase 1 ECUs are unprogrammable. You can't flash them. Some of the later ones you can, but the old ones, you can't flash them. You can't do anything with them. That's another reason to stay away from the Phase 1s. It will be a pain in the butt in the long run. And if you're like me, where you love your car, and it's a never-ending story to where, yeah, sure, you got it to a point now, and then now you're just like, you know what, can I get a little more power out of it? Can I add this? Can I make it lighter? Can I make it faster? You're going to be really shooting yourself in the foot in the long run if you stick with a Phase 1. So, this has been Otaku Phil. Again, if you guys have any questions, any comments, leave it down in the comments section, and I'll try to answer them as soon as I can. The Beetle's still coming along, and hopefully I should have it running in the next week or two here. It's been super busy. I've been working, and everybody's been just super busy, so it's been hard to keep on it. If you guys have any questions, if you're in LA and you want to come check out the Beetle, or you have a deal and you want me to come take a look at it, I got friends that can easily help you out. I got some guys who can easily help you out with your build and pull from your donor car and all that good stuff if you need. So just shoot me an email, shoot me link in the comments. Shoot me a private message, and I'll keep in touch. I'll keep you guys posted. Keep modding. Have fun.